Hello there, everyone, and welcome to another one of my live stream conversations. Today, we're going to be talking about retaining neurodivergent employees. We're going to talk about why retention particularly matters. We're going to talk about the practical and structural barriers and some of the solutions that you can use to work with those, and then the personal and social barriers in an organization, and also the approaches you can take to address those as well. Just a quick content warning before we get going. There will be a bit of discussion, though not detailed descriptions, of bullying and harassment and social isolation in this talk. If you're watching live, please do ask questions, and or in fact, if you're watching the recording, ask questions in the comments. I'd love to answer them and perhaps even bring them in at a later date. So this is a personally interesting one for me, as someone who worked in organisations, has worked in large organisations or some organisations most of my life, and I've definitely experienced some of these barriers before I knew I was neurodivergent, or as neurodivergent as I am. And that's definitely a lot of these things really resonated for me. So what I want to talk about first is that this really isn't just, neurodiversity at work is really not just a recruitment issue. It's really great that we've made progress in this area and made some really big steps forward. Things like getting interview questions in advance are starting to be normalized. We're starting to actually make things much more accessible at an interview basis. However, the question is, what happens once you are recruited? And this is getting much less attention, and this is why I really wanted to talk about this topic today. Unfortunately, neurodivergent people are very often seeing glass ceilings where there are basically no, certainly openly neurodivergent people above that level in the organization, and that can, this operates in the way that glass ceilings operate for many different types of people. And I think what's interesting is that you can have different heights of glass ceiling for different groups and identities. So it's really interesting to see where basically a particular marginalized or minoritized group no longer gets representation in an organization. And even though neurodivergent people might be able to get into work, there is still significant difficulty staying employed. So actually being able to maintain employment, either through being fired, being made redundant, and particularly burning out, those are all really big risks for neurodivergent people. So quite a lot more neurodivergent people a part of staff turnover. They can't always stay in an organization as long as they're neurotypical employees. And this is despite, particularly for autistic people, a long-term loyal employment being actually, where a lot of their strengths lie. So this really isn't okay, so we're talking about people with ADHD and they might just move jobs all the time. This is definitely a real risk and a real problem for people who are neurodivergent. And related to the burnout risk is the difficulty finding satisfying work. And when I say satisfying work, I mean work that is to our level of ability, where we are appropriately employed. Whilst many neurodivergent people are still unemployed, many, many more are underemployed, under-challenged, not able to contribute their full amount in the workplace, even though they are working. And this leads to a lack of feeling satisfied at work, feeling that work is actually meaningful. It also leads to the kind of rewards that come with that. And I wanted to add, one of the really valuable aspects of neurodivergent people at work is this concept of positive deviance. And I've used this a couple of times in a few articles I've written before. And this idea that actually just being exactly the same as everyone else and following the rules or following the norms isn't always desirable. There is a category of working outside of norms where you do things better. And neurodivergent people very often uncover aspects of positive deviance that can then be really used by the rest of the organization and adopted more widely. So All of these things tend to get missed out on when neurodivergent people aren't fully supported throughout their entire career life cycle, rather than just at that recruitment phase. So now I'd like to move on to the kind of practical and structural barriers that we as neurodivergent people often face. The first one of these is appropriate on-the-job adjustments. Now, in the UK, organisations are expected to make reasonable adjustments under the Equalities Act for people who are disabled, and neurodiversity falls into that category. In the US, the Americans with Disability Act also covers making reasonable adjustments for people and adjusting for disabled employees. But a lot of organisations don't really succeed in this. They often, the adjustments are sometimes very cookie cutter, very standardized. Like if you say, oh yes, I'm dyslexic, you won't get to explain what you actually need. You'll just get a screen reader or Dragon Naturally Speaking or whatever it is, or a coloured overlay. All of these things that don't necessarily reflect your strengths and your role. And what you need to do, but are kind of very generalized and don't really support you. That's if things are available at all. Now, one of the other big areas in this is appropriate learning and development materials. A key part of retaining an employee is developing them and having that career grow and develop as the employee works for the organization. There are huge benefits to keeping employees with knowledge of different roles for a longer period of time to many, many organizations. So actually expecting people to learn and develop is a really key part of this. If your learning and development materials are not accessible to neurodivergent people, then those people are excluded from that process. So you miss out on that development, and then people either end up stuck in a low-level role or just give up and leave. And related to the learning materials is the formal assessments. We think quite a lot about recruitment processes, but are our internal promotion processes, development processes, all of those processes, are they as accessible as our external recruitment process? Or are we repeating the kinds of mistakes that organizations have often in the past, and still do make, in the recruitment process, where we make things unnecessarily inaccessible to our neurodivergent employees? Now, one of the really, really big areas that this happens is people assessing skills that they think are related to the job, but aren't actually that closely related. So these assessment methods, we need to be really, really careful about how much we are really assessing. And this can actually show up quite a lot in some of the more soft assessments too, the kind of personality assessment questionnaires, those kind of things. They often fail neurodivergent employees. They don't capture how neurodivergent employees actually are. There's some argument about how much they capture anyone's experience, but they definitely fail neurodivergent employees very often. So being really careful about where we're assessing this and saying, okay, this person on the basis of this formal assessment can or can't do this role. Making things much, much closer to the way that the job is done, on the job assessment of work done, rather than formal kind of artificial assessment, is much, much more effective and much fairer for everyone. And kind of related to this way that skills cluster issue, that neurodivergent people often have a different array of skills, a different constellation of abilities compared to their neurotypical employees. You'll very often find that whilst a neurodivergent person might not have skill A and skill B that are expected to go together. They might well have skill C that isn't expected to go with skill A all the time. And that is actually a really valuable thing. That means that people can contribute in different ways, can cross different functions in an organization, can bridge different functions, different ways of thinking. It also means that they can bring together more innovative ideas by combining different fields and different areas of knowledge that the organization wouldn't otherwise have done. However, it can be a real problem when our developmental pathways assume that if you develop skill A, you must also develop skill B. And you see this very often in organizations where, particularly into leadership roles, we see a certain expected set of skills that don't necessarily correlate with the way that leadership is done, or they select for a very specific style of leadership, without accepting that someone could lead in different ways. One of the other ways I see this very often in organizations, is that once you reach a certain level of being a subject matter expert in whatever it is that you do, you're expected to take on significant line management responsibility. And this can be a real barrier to people who struggle with line management responsibility for whatever reason. They might be great subject matter experts and they might be great have a role in strategic leadership. But if we assume that, okay, you're good at doing this, so you must be good at managing people doing this, we make a really serious mistake that can exclude a lot of people who are really good and also can promote people who just aren't suited to a line management role, and also mean that we lose that subject matter expert doing the job. So it's really important to think about how flexible our job descriptions are, how they cluster those skills, and whether we can actually allow employees to use more of their strengths, even when those combinations of strengths are unexpected, than we currently do. Now, I want to talk about the personal and social barriers that neurodivergent people often face in the workplace that can prevent that progression and can be a challenge to employee retention as well. The first one of these is prejudice and misinformation. We know that many managers are prejudiced against neurodivergent employees, have very fixed ideas about what neurodivergent employees can and can't do with a given condition, and that when they find out an employee is neurodivergent, they are less likely to put them forward for certain roles, regardless of their skill. So they're making a judgment based on a stereotyped idea of the condition rather than the individual themselves. And because people aren't all psychologists, they aren't experts, and because our models of what our neurodivergent conditions are changing and being developed and updating, there is a lot of outdated information out there as well. So it can be a thing that, if your model of what neurodiversity or what autism is based on 20 years ago, it's very, very different to how we understand the condition today. And so if that's what a manager is operating from, they're not going to be able to work well with a person with that condition based on those assumptions. And this can lead to people just not declaring that they have a condition at all, which is unfortunately is actually, for some people, is the most sensible approach in an organization. It's the least bad option. However, not declaring means that you don't get the opportunity to ask for all of the accommodations that could be really useful in supporting you. It avoids the prejudice, but it's really a very difficult decision for people to make, and it kind of has negatives each way. So it's really, really important for anyone who's working in this kind of organizational development role to make sure that managers understand that neurodiversity is a changing field. They don't necessarily have to keep up to date with everything, but that they have the necessary information up to date, maintained, available at their fingertips, and that they can know and find out when it matters. And it's also really important that it puts this in the context of whatever those people are managing, whatever role, whatever function they're managing, so that they don't have to do so much of that translation work. Because that can be, what does this abstract, kind of slightly medicalized description mean to me with my team? Is a really difficult description, really difficult thing to do. So either getting someone in to help with that, or if you have the skills in the organization doing that yourself, making those resources available to managers is really, really important. And related to this prejudice and misinformation, the kind of informal evaluation that neurodivergent employees often face is another big barrier to retention. And when I say informal evaluation, I mean the stuff that actually happens quite a lot in organizations, but happens outside of an established process that's really, that has oversight by HR or by senior leadership. It's the kind of thing that actually over time can really add up. That this kind of evaluation of should I give this work to this person? It's a bit of a reach. It's a difficult job. If I've got a low evaluation of a person's ability that isn't based in reality, I'm less likely to give them an appropriate level of challenging work. So if someone's misunderstanding someone's ability and being too low in their evaluation, they hold that employee back. So these informal evaluations can be a real challenge. Another area that this can be a challenge is with an immediate team and being what's sometimes called a team player. Now, this crosses over both in terms of workplace performance, but it's much more of a social issue. Teams are a social context. We're not just talking about working, just doing a job. It's about how you get on with people, how you function with people, how you interact with people throughout the day. If people don't understand someone's way of being, someone's strengths, someone's weaknesses, someone's preferences, they might misunderstand and take that the wrong way. And I did a live stream a few weeks ago about the risk of misunderstandings and neurodiversity. And this is a really big issue here, particularly in that team context. It can lead to people feeling very socially marginalized and very isolated, so that they're not part of any of the socialization that goes on in the team. That leads to reduced support. It leads to a whole load of really, really difficult things that can lead to the employee not being fully supported. To address this, one of the biggest ways is to make sure that if your organization is making efforts to support people in socialization, in these kind of team building activities, then make sure that you're doing a range of those that support a range of different preferences and abilities. Unfortunately, it's still true in many organizations that the vast majority of socialization happens after work on a Friday night in the pub or in the bar. And that can marginalize a whole bunch of people. It's not just neurodivergent people who might find that situation overwhelming or too intense. It might cover people who don't drink because they are a recovering alcoholic, or for religious reasons, or because they're pregnant, or whatever there might be. You're marginalizing a whole bunch of people by just doing that. And I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying do something else as well. Do a range of different things that work for everyone in the team. Now, unfortunately, one of the really, really big risks of being neurodivergent is to face bullying and harassment. Neurodivergent employees are at much, much greater risk of bullying and harassment for a variety of reasons, actually, than many other colleagues. It's a really significant issue. I mean, it's the vast majority of neurodivergent people have experienced, who have been in the workplace, have experienced bullying, harassment at some point in their working career. I'm included in that group as well. And the issues are around the misunderstandings, as I said, and also potentially around the fact that people are innovative, people are making change or offering a possible change and doing things differently. And for many people, that can be a real threat to the way that they're working and the way that they see the world. That threat then gets projected outwards onto a person, which can lead to all sorts of really, really difficult behaviors. And again, if that comes to light, if it's taken seriously, which it isn't always, because the kind of, this is one of the issues for neurodivergent people is actually getting it taken seriously can be a real issue. If it even is taken seriously and addressed, the kind of experiences that people find overwhelming aren't always the kind of experiences that neurotypical people feel are that difficult, or it's not fully understood. So people don't always get the systemic backup as well. It's really, really important that people feel fully supported by both their managers and by the wider organization. Now, on a deeper level, this is about cultivating psychological safety. This is about making sure that everyone in the organization feels that they are supported, looked after, that they can deal with issues, that they can ask questions, and that really involves building quite a lot of trust within the organization. So if this feels like a challenge for you, if there is an issue here, first of all, if you just ask people and it's not anonymous and you have low psychological safety, they won't tell you anyway. So make sure that anything is genuinely anonymous. If you're one of those organizations that does anonymous surveys, stop doing that, because you're ruining all the trust that you have with your employees. So really building that trust instead and making sure that people can make an informed decision and come to a working relationship with their managers, with their peers, with everyone else is the way to address this ultimately. And so when we combine both of these things, when we combine both the personal and social barriers that we've seen and the practical and structural barriers, we should be able to see much more progress from neurodivergent employees. The barriers will be reduced, and we should see all of the benefits that accrue from employing neurodivergent people much more fully than we do right now. I've got a viewer question that was left on the live stream I did last week that I'd like to share a quick answer to as well before I wrap up. The question was, how can the commenter had found what I'd shared very useful, but wanted to know how they could share this kind of thing with the managers and leaders in their organization. So this can actually be a real issue, I think. It's not always, it can be too much of a leap for someone who's completely new to the idea of neurodiversity to go straight into something where a lot of the language is new, a lot of the ideas are brand new. And again, as I mentioned earlier, where they can't quite work out how that really relates to what they do and their role and the objectives of the organization. So my advice here is to start at an appropriate level. Start with things that are familiar to them. I think there's a lot of resources and really good articles now from really mainstream business publications like Forbes, the Harvard Business Review, the World Economic Forum, talking about the value of neurodiversity. So starting with that, starting them to get the why they should be interested, and then thinking about how that might manifest for them, and then bring them into the stuff of your own personal experience and how that links up would be my suggestion. If you found this useful, please do add any comments, any questions based on what I've said today, and hopefully I'll get back to them in a future live stream. And do be aware that I will also be sharing the full resources, so the some of the citations that I mentioned that you could probably see in my notes, and a full transcript on my own website, which is linked in the show notes. I hope that was good, useful for you, and I will see you again soon. Goodbye.